Bear refuses to leave injured sibling. What happened next left everyone in tears. On a cold, rainy morning along Highway 12 near the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, Mrs. Helen Morgan gripped her steering wheel tighter as sheets of rain pelted her windshield. The 76-year-old retired teacher had just spent a pleasant weekend with her sister in Boone and was making her way back to Asheville, where she had lived for the past 40 years. The windshield wipers worked furiously against the downpour, barely keeping up with the torrent that seemed determined to obscure her vision. Helen had always loved this drive through the mountains. Even on dreary days like this, there was something about the mist clinging to the ancient peaks, the way the fog wrapped around the tall pines like ghostly fingers, that spoke to her soul. She taught natural sciences at Asheville High School for over 3 decades, and the Blue Ridge Mountains had been her greatest classroom. But today, with visibility reduced to mere yards ahead, she found herself leaning forward in her seat, straining to see the road. It was just past a sharp bend when Helen saw something that made her tap the brakes instinctively. Through the curtain of rain, a dark mass lay on the shoulder of the road. At first, she thought it might be a fallen tree branch, but as she slowed her car, her heart sank. The unmistakable form of a black bear lay motionless on the wet asphalt, its fur slick with rain and something darker that Helen immediately recognized as blood. Tire marks on the road told the story. A vehicle, likely a truck, given the size of the bear, had struck the animal and continued on without stopping. Helen had seen roadkill before. It was an unfortunate reality of rural mountain living. But something about this scene made her pull over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking in the gray morning light. As she peered through her passenger window, she noticed movement near the bear's body. Her breath caught in her throat, 2 small forms huddled beside the fallen animal. Bear cubs? One pressing itself against its mother's side, while the other appeared to be partially trapped beneath the larger bear's body. "Oh dear God," Helen whispered, reaching for her cell phone. Despite her 76 years, Helen Morgan moved with purpose. She grabbed her umbrella from the back seat, pulled her raincoat tighter around her thin frame, and stepped out into the deluge. The wind immediately caught her umbrella, nearly wrenching it from her grasp, but she held firm and made her way carefully down the slight embankment to where the bears lay. The closer she got, the more her heart ached. The mother bear was clearly dead, her eyes open but unseeing, fixed on some distant point. Beside her, one cub, a bit larger than its sibling, was rubbing its head against its mother's face, making soft whimpering sounds that cut through Helen like a knife. The second cub was struggling weakly, pinned beneath its mother's heavy hindquarters, its small face contorted in pain. Helen stopped at what she hoped was a safe distance. Though the cubs were small, perhaps only a few months old, she knew even young bears could be dangerous when frightened. But neither cub seemed to register her presence, lost as they were in their own tragedy. "It's okay," she said softly, though she knew they couldn't understand. "I'm going to get you help." With trembling fingers, Helen dialed 911, only to be told that animal control would be notified but might not arrive for hours. Unsatisfied, she ended that call and began searching through her contacts for the number of the wildlife rehabilitation center she had visited with her students years ago. When that yielded no immediate response, she called the local veterinary clinic, the Forest Service office, and finally, on a recommendation from the Forest Service dispatcher, Wild Care Center in Boone. The rain had soaked through her coat by the time a woman's voice answered. "Wild Care, this is Rachel." "My name is Helen Morgan," she said, her voice steady despite the cold seeping into her bones. "I'm on Highway 12, about 15 miles east of Asheville." There's been an accident. A mother bear has been killed, and her cubs are here. One is trapped under her body. The voice on the other end sharpened immediately. Are you safe, ma'am? Are you in your vehicle? No, Helen admitted. I'm standing near them. I couldn't leave them in the rain. There was a brief pause. Then, Mrs. Morgan, I need you to return to your vehicle for safety. I'm Dr. Rachel Evans, the director here. I'm going to dispatch our rescue team immediately, but it will take us about 45 minutes to reach you. Can you stay until we arrive? Of course I can, Helen said, though she made no move toward her car. Instead, she adjusted her position so that her umbrella sheltered the cubs as much as possible from the relentless downpour. I'll be waiting. The larger cub, the one not trapped, looked up at her then, its dark eyes reflecting a depth of sorrow that seemed impossible for a wild animal. It let out another whimper, then pressed its muzzle against its mother's cold fur. The smaller cub continued to struggle weakly, its efforts growing more feeble by the minute. Helen stood her ground, ignoring the cold rain that ran down her back where the umbrella couldn't protect her. She began to talk softly to the cubs, the same gentle voice she had used with frightened children during her teaching years. Help is coming, she promised them. Just hold on a little longer. The 45 minutes stretched into an hour as Helen maintained her vigil. Traffic occasionally passed, slowing to observe the strange tableau of an elderly woman standing in the rain beside a dead bear, but no one stopped. Helen's legs began to ache, and her hands grew numb around the umbrella handle, but she didn't move. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the steady drumming of rain. A white van with Wildcare Wildlife Rehabilitation Center emblazoned on its side pulled up behind Helen's car, followed by a pickup truck. 4 people emerged, donning raincoats and carrying equipment. A tall woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail approached Helen first, medical kit in hand. Mrs. Morgan, I'm Dr. Rachel Evans. Thank you for staying with them. Helen nodded, suddenly feeling every one of her 76 years. The little one under the mother, I think it's badly hurt. Rachel nodded grimly, surveying the scene with practiced eyes. Ben, she called to a young man unloading equipment from the truck. We'll need the hydraulic lift. Mark, Jessica, tranquilizer kits ready, please. The team moved with quiet efficiency, setting up equipment around the bears. Ben, a muscular man in his 30s with kind eyes, approached Helen. Ma'am, would you like to wait in our van? It's warm, and you must be freezing. Helen hesitated, looking back at the cubs. Will they be all right? Dr. Evans is the best wildlife vet in 3 states, he assured her. If anyone can help them, she can. Reluctantly, Helen allowed herself to be led to the van, where she sank gratefully into the passenger seat. Through the windshield, she watched as Rachel and her team worked to position the hydraulic equipment beside the mother bear's body. Rachel approached the cubs with slow, deliberate movements, speaking in low tones. The free cub, the larger one, backed away slightly but didn't flee, its eyes never leaving its trapped sibling. With expert precision, Rachel managed to administer a mild sedative to both cubs, just enough to keep them calm during the rescue. Then came the moment Helen would never forget. As the team carefully lifted the mother bear's body, the freed cub, despite its sedation, pressed forward, pushing its head against its mother's face one final time. The sound it made was unlike anything Helen had ever heard, not quite a growl, not quite a cry, but something that transcended species and spoke directly to the heart. A farewell. Even from a distance, Helen could see Rachel wipe at her eyes before turning her attention to the injured cub. The smaller animal lay motionless where it had been pinned, its hind leg bent at an unnatural angle, fur matted with blood. Rachel worked quickly, stabilizing the leg and checking for other injuries before carefully transferring the cub to a waiting transport cage. The larger cub made no attempt to escape as Mark, a gray-haired man with weathered features, gently guided it into a separate cage. Both animals were loaded into the van, and Rachel approached Helen's window. "Mrs. Morgan, you did a wonderful thing today," she said, rain streaming down her face. "Would you like to follow us back to the center? I can have someone drive your car if you're too tired." Helen straightened in her seat. "I can drive myself, thank you. And yes, I'd like to see what happens to them." Rachel smiled. "We're calling them Hope and Spirit." The name seemed fitting. Hope is the bigger one who stayed by his mother. Spirit is the fighter who was trapped. Hope and Spirit, Helen repeated, feeling the rightness of the names. "I'll be right behind you." The journey to the Wild Care Center took another 40 minutes, the caravan moving carefully through the rain-slicked mountain roads. By the time they arrived at the facility, a sprawling complex nestled against the edge of the forest. The rain had finally begun to subside, though the sky remained heavy with clouds. Helen followed Rachel and Ben into the treatment area, where Spirit was already being prepared for surgery. The small cub lay unconscious on an examination table, monitoring equipment beeping steadily as Rachel assessed the damage. "Compound fracture of the right femur," Rachel murmured, gentle fingers probing the injured leg. "Significant blood loss. Extensive soft tissue damage. He's dehydrated too. They've probably been out there since yesterday at least." Ben nodded, preparing surgical instruments. "What about the other one?" "No obvious physical injuries, but also dehydrated and likely hasn't eaten in days." The stress alone, Rachel glanced up, noticing Helen standing quietly by the door. "Mrs. Morgan, this might take a while. There's a waiting area with coffee just down the hall if you'd like to rest." "I'd rather stay, if that's all right," Helen said. "I taught biology for 35 years, I won't get in the way." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but please let us know if you need anything." For the next 3 hours, Helen watched in quiet admiration as Rachel and her team worked to save Spirit's leg. The surgery was complex, requiring pins to stabilize the shattered bone and meticulous repair of damaged blood vessels and muscle tissue. Throughout it all, Rachel's hands never wavered, her focus absolute. In an adjacent room, Hope had been settled in a recovery enclosure after receiving fluids and a thorough examination, but the young bear refused to eat the offered food, pacing restlessly and clawing at the enclosure walls, clearly distressed by separation from its sibling. "He knows his brother is in trouble," Jessica, a young woman who had been monitoring Hope, told Helen. "Bears have incredibly strong family bonds, especially between siblings from the same litter." As evening fell, Spirit's surgery was finally complete. The small bear was moved to a recovery enclosure near Hope's, still under sedation but stable. Rachel looked exhausted as she pulled off her surgical gloves and mask. "We've done all we can for now," she told Helen. "The next 24 hours will be critical." Helen nodded, staring at the tiny form breathing shallowly under warming blankets. "May I come back tomorrow?" "Of course," Rachel said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. There was something about this elderly teacher that inspired confidence, a steadiness that reminded Rachel of her own grandmother. "We open at 7. Helen returned to her car, the events of the day settling heavily on her shoulders as she drove the remaining distance to her home in Asheville. She found herself thinking not of her close call with the bears, nor of the cold and rain, but of that sound, that goodbye Hope had made to his mother. Some things, Helen reflected, were universal across species: grief, love, the bonds of family. That night, while Helen slept fitfully in her bed in Asheville, chaos erupted at the Wild Care Center. Hope, despite his exhaustion and dehydration, somehow managed to break through the divider between his enclosure and Spirit's. Ben, who had stayed overnight to monitor the cubs, rushed into the recovery room to find Hope had collapsed beside his brother's cage, paws extended through the bars to touch Spirit's still form. Instead of separating them again, Ben, after a quick call to Rachel, made the decision to carefully move Spirit into Hope's larger enclosure. The moment the two cubs were reunited, Hope curled protectively around his injured sibling, licking Spirit's face and wounds with gentle attention. Spirit, still groggy from anesthesia, pressed weakly against his brother's warmth. When Rachel arrived early the next morning, she found them exactly like that, two small bears huddled together against the world, inseparable even in their darkest hour. She was still watching them, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, when Helen Morgan arrived promptly at 7 o'clock. "They made it through the night," Rachel said by way of greeting. Helen peered through the observation window at the sleeping cubs. "Together," she noted. "As they should be." Over the next few weeks, Helen became a regular presence at the Wild Care Center. Though she had initially planned just a few visits, she found herself drawn back day after day, watching as Spirit slowly regained strength and Hope remained his constant guardian. Bears typically stay with their mothers for about 18 months, Rachel explained one afternoon as they watched Hope bring food to Spirit, who was still struggling with mobility. They learn everything from her: how to find food, avoid dangers, survive the winter. Without that guidance, they'll never be able to return to the wild, Helen finished the thought. Rachel sighed. "That's what I'm afraid of. They're already losing their natural fear of humans. Spirit's leg is healing well, but they both need more than just medical care. They need to learn how to be wild bears." Helen considered this, watching as Hope gently nudged Spirit to his feet, supporting him as he practiced walking on his healing leg. What about a sanctuary? Somewhere they could be free but still protected. "I've been thinking about that," Rachel admitted. "I have a colleague, Mark Reynolds. You met him briefly on the day of the rescue. He manages a 100-hectare sanctuary on the edge of Pisgah Forest. It's designed for exactly this kind of situation: rehabilitation with minimal human contact, teaching survival skills to orphaned wildlife. I've worked with him before on similar cases." Hope had now coaxed Spirit to the water trough, standing guard while his brother drank. The bond between them was unmistakable. Wherever one went, the other followed, always in physical contact, always aware of the other's needs. "They need each other," Helen observed. "Whatever you decide, they must stay together." Rachel nodded. "Absolutely. They've lost enough already." By the time Spirit's leg had healed enough for more extensive movement, summer had arrived in the mountains. The days grew longer and warmer, perfect for the next phase of the cubs' journey. After extensive discussion with her team and with Helen's thoughtful input, Rachel made arrangements for Hope and Spirit to be transferred to Mark Reynolds's sanctuary. The day of the transfer was bittersweet. Helen arrived early, bearing a basket of fresh berries, not for the bears, who needed to learn to forage for themselves, but for the staff who had worked so tirelessly for the cubs' recovery. "This isn't goodbye," Rachel assured her as they watched Ben and Jessica prepare the transport cages. "You'll always be welcome to visit the sanctuary, and I'll keep you updated on their progress." Helen smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I know. But they're moving on to the next chapter, and so must I. My grandchildren are visiting next week, first time in years. Life keeps moving forward." The cubs, now considerably larger than when they'd first arrived, entered their transport cages with minimal coaxing. They had grown accustomed to the routines of the center, to the voices of the humans who cared for them. That familiarity was both a blessing and a curse. It had aided in their recovery, but distanced them from their wild nature. As the transport vehicle pulled away, Helen and Rachel stood side by side, watching until it disappeared down the winding mountain road. "You know," Helen said quietly, "I've lived in these mountains my whole life, seen bears from a distance, taught children about them, but I never truly understood them until that day in the rain." Rachel nodded. "They change you, don't they? Make you see the world differently." "They do indeed," Helen agreed. "They certainly do." Part 2, Return to the Wild. The sanctuary was everything Rachel had promised. A vast expanse of protected forest with natural features that mirrored the wilderness beyond its boundaries. Streams cut through valleys of rich vegetation. Rocky outcroppings provided shelter and den sites. Mature trees offered both food and escape routes. It was a perfect classroom for two young bears who needed to relearn what their mother would have taught them. Mark Reynolds met the transport vehicle at the sanctuary's main gate, his weathered face breaking into a smile as Rachel emerged. "Been a while, Doc," he said, embracing her briefly. "These the brothers I've been hearing so much about?" Rachel nodded, leading him to the back of the vehicle, where Ben was already preparing to unload the cages. "Hope and Spirit. Spirit's the smaller one with the healing leg. He's still favoring it a bit, but the bone has mended well." Mark peered into the cages, his experienced eyes assessing the cubs. "Good size for their age. Strong. Eyes alert. You've done well with them so far." "We've kept human interaction to a minimum these past few weeks," Rachel explained. "But they still have a long way to go before they're ready for full release." 6 months minimum, Mark agreed. "Maybe longer, depending on how quickly they adapt. Winter will be the real test. They'll need to understand denning behavior before the snow comes." The cubs were transferred to a large naturalistic enclosure within the sanctuary, the first of several progressively less controlled environments they would experience during their rehabilitation. This initial space, while spacious, allowed the sanctuary staff to monitor the bears closely, provide supplemental food if necessary, and intervene if any health issues arose. Hope was the first to explore their new surroundings, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. He discovered the streams, berry bushes, and hollow logs that had been incorporated into the design. Spirit followed more slowly, still slightly awkward on his healing leg but visibly stronger than he had been at the center. "The big one's a natural leader," Mark observed as Hope scaled a young oak tree, then returned to coax his brother to follow. "That'll serve them well." For the next 6 months, Hope and Spirit underwent an intensive education in being bears. Under Mark's guidance, and with occasional visits from Rachel, they learned to forage for natural foods, digging for grubs and roots, fishing in the stream, harvesting berries and nuts. They practiced climbing trees to escape danger, building winter dens, and marking territory. Most importantly, they began to develop a healthy fear of humans. Mark and his team used aversive conditioning techniques, loud noises, unpleasant scents, and other deterrents. Whenever the bears approached human structures or showed too much interest in people, it was necessary cruelty, teaching a lesson that might one day save their lives. With each passing week, the cubs grew more independent and more bear-like in their behavior. Hope remained the more adventurous of the pair, often leading explorations into new areas of the sanctuary as they were granted access to larger territories. Spirit, though physically recovered, stayed more cautious, a watchful counterbalance to his brother's boldness. Rachel visited monthly, observing from a distance as the cubs transformed from dependent orphans to capable young bears. During one autumn visit, as crimson and gold leaves carpeted the sanctuary floor, she stood beside Mark on an observation platform watching Hope teach Spirit how to break open a rotting log for insects. "They're ready," Mark said quietly. "The first snow is predicted next week, perfect timing for them to complete their den and settle in for winter." Rachel nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and melancholy that came with successful rehabilitation cases. "And after winter, if they emerge healthy in spring, we'll open the sanctuary gates. The choice will be theirs." Throughout the winter months, as snow blanketed the Blue Ridge Mountains, Hope and Spirit slumbered in the den they had created beneath the roots of a massive old oak. Their metabolism slowed, their breathing became shallow, and they lived off the fat reserves they had built during the abundant fall. It was their first winter without their mother, but instinct guided them through the long, cold months. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the first tentative wildflowers and the return of birdsong to the forest, Rachel made the journey to the sanctuary once more. Helen Morgan accompanied her, having kept in regular contact throughout the bears' rehabilitation. "I wanted to be here," Helen explained as Mark drove them through the sanctuary in his battered Jeep, "to see the end of their story, or rather, the beginning of their new one." They parked at a discreet distance from the den site and approached on foot, moving quietly through the underbrush. Mark led them to a camouflage blind about 50 yards from where the bears had wintered. "They emerged 3 days ago," he whispered as they settled into the blind. "Been actively feeding since then, rebuilding their strength. They look good, healthy, alert. Hope's nearly twice the size he was last fall." For 2 hours, they waited in patient silence. Then, just as the morning sun reached its peak, movement at the den entrance caught their attention. Hope emerged first, his black coat glossy in the spring light, his body lean but powerful after the winter fast. He stood upright, testing the air with his nose, scanning the forest with keen eyes that missed nothing. Behind him came Spirit, no longer the fragile, injured cub they had rescued nearly a year before. Though still smaller than his brother, he moved with confidence, his once broken leg bearing his weight without hesitation. "Oh my," Helen breathed, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Look at them." The bears moved through the forest with purpose, stopping to overturn rocks and investigate fresh growth. They were the picture of wild health, alert, self-sufficient, wary of their surroundings. When a distant sound startled them, both immediately froze, then moved swiftly toward the nearest climbable tree, exactly as they should. "Today's the day," Mark said softly. "I've already opened the northeast gate. It leads directly into Pisgah National Forest, hundreds of thousands of acres of protected wilderness." Rachel nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Will you guide them toward it?" "No need," Mark replied. "They've been exploring in that direction for weeks. They know the scent of the greater forest beyond. When they're ready, they'll find their way." They returned to Mark's cabin for lunch, giving the bears space to go about their day undisturbed. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Mark received a radio call from one of his staff stationed near the northeast gate. "They're heading that way," he announced, looking up from the radio. "If you want to see them off." The northeast observation point was a small elevated platform concealed among the trees, offering a clear view of the gate without being visible to animals on the ground. Rachel, Helen, and Mark took their positions in silence, binoculars ready. The bears appeared just before sunset, moving with deliberate steps toward the open gate. They paused at the threshold, Hope slightly ahead, Spirit at his shoulder. For several long moments, they simply stood there, sniffing the air beyond the sanctuary, sensing the vastness of the wilderness that awaited them. Then, as if responding to some silent signal, both bears turned their heads in unison, looking directly toward the hidden observation platform. Though logically Rachel knew they couldn't possibly see the humans concealed there, she felt the weight of their gaze as surely as if they stood face to face. In that moment, something passed between species, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or a farewell. Hope's dark eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding that transcended his wild nature, while Spirit's steady gaze conveyed a quiet resilience born of suffering and healing. Then the moment broke. Hope turned away first, stepping confidently through the gate into the forest beyond. Spirit followed, pausing once more at the threshold to look back before disappearing after his brother into the gathering dusk. "Goodbye," Rachel whispered, too softly for anyone else to hear. "Be wild. Be free." Helen reached over to squeeze Rachel's hand, her own eyes damp. "They'll be all right," she said with the quiet certainty of someone who had witnessed the beginning of this journey and now its culmination. They have each other. Life moved forward, as it always does. Helen returned to Asheville, where she continued her peaceful retirement, volunteering at local schools and sharing her experience with the bear cubs to inspire a new generation of conservationists. The story of her roadside rescue spread throughout the community, adding another layer to the legacy of a woman already beloved for her decades of teaching. Rachel remained at the Wild Care Center, saving countless other wild lives, though she often told her staff that no case ever quite affected her like Hope and Spirit. She purchased a small cabin on the edge of Pisgah Forest, not far from where the bears had been released, spending weekends there whenever her busy schedule allowed. On spring nights, with her cabin windows open to the mountain air, Rachel sometimes heard bear vocalizations echoing from the distant ridges, the familiar sounds of black bears going about their lives in the forest. She could never be certain, of course, but she liked to imagine that some of those calls belonged to Hope and Spirit, now fully grown and thriving in their ancestral home. Occasionally, she would find bear tracks around her cabin, not unusual in these mountains, but some were distinctive. One set always showed a slight irregularity in the right hind paw, a subtle reminder of a once shattered leg that had healed strong, but not perfect. On one memorable morning, Rachel emerged from her cabin to find her bird feeder destroyed, a common bear mischief, but beside it lay a perfect, untouched apple from her porch bowl. She stood for a long time, staring at that apple, wondering at the selective destruction that had spared only this one item, almost as if it had been deliberately left as a calling card. Years passed. Helen Morgan celebrated her 80th birthday surrounded by family, friends, and former students. Among her gifts was a handcrafted wooden bear carved by one of Mark's sanctuary volunteers with a simple inscription, "For the woman who stopped in the rain." At wildlife conservation seminars across the country, Rachel often shared the story of Hope and Spirit, using their journey to illustrate the challenges facing wildlife in an increasingly human-dominated landscape. She always ended these presentations the same way: we think we're saving wildlife, but sometimes they're the ones saving our souls. Kinship and courage don't belong only to humans. They belong to all living things, connecting us in ways we're only beginning to understand. On the 10th anniversary of the Bears' release, Rachel and Helen met for lunch in Asheville, their friendship having deepened over the years despite the differences in their ages and backgrounds. "Do you ever wonder about them?" Helen asked as they shared a pot of tea. "Where they are now? What they're doing?" Rachel smiled, stirring honey into her cup. "Every day. But I don't need to know. That's the beauty of true rehabilitation: they don't belong to us anymore. They belong to themselves. To the mountains. To the wild, where they were always meant to be." Helen nodded, gazing out the cafe window toward the distant blue peaks that had defined her entire life. "Still, I like to think they remember. That somewhere out there, they know we cared." "I believe they do," Rachel said softly. "In whatever way bears understand such things." As they parted that afternoon, neither woman could have known that high on a forested ridge not 10 miles from where they sat, two male bears, one slightly larger than the other, both in their prime, were sharing the bounty of a wild apple tree. They moved with the easy familiarity of lifelong companions, communicating through subtle body language and occasional soft vocalizations. When the smaller bear limped slightly after descending from the tree, the larger one paused, waiting for his brother to catch up before they continued their journey together through the ancient forest that was their home. Hope and spirit remain symbols of what can happen when human compassion meets wild resilience. Two hearts that beat first in fear and pain, then in healing and strength, and finally in the pure freedom of being exactly what nature intended them to be: wild bears, brothers, survivors. And in the stories told throughout the Blue Ridge communities, stories of bears that seemed to understand gratitude, of tracks found outside certain cabins, of apples mysteriously left untouched amid destruction, their legacy lived on, reminding all who heard it that the bond between living beings transcends species, language, and even the divide between wild and tame. In the end, that was the true gift of hope and spirit, not just their survival, but the lesson they imparted: that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in moments of greatest vulnerability, and that kindness, once offered, creates ripples that continue long after the initial act is forgotten.